It's so great to see a full room, and so many of you. I've seen many of you at other CERL events and law school events, and this is yet another really tremendous topical event being hosted by our Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is a really tremendous, cutting-edge, cross-disciplinary kind of research and policy kind of thought leadership group that we have here. And I just want to appreciate and thank the kind of founding academic leader of CERL, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who will speak in a few minutes, and really appreciate our distinguished guest, Kathleen Jamieson, for walking a few blocks across campus and joining us here at the law school. You're always welcome. And again, with appreciation for all of you coming, come often and early and often to CERL events. This could not be more topical, of course, with the question of foreign interference with our democracy. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to our executive director for CERL, Chris Welsh, who will lead us into the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind words, and also just for your continued support of the center. We really appreciate it. So good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to CERL's final book talk of the academic year. As the dean said, my name is Chris Welsh. I'm the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law here. We began this year with a riveting discussion with General Michael Hayden about his book, The Assault on Intelligence, American National Security in the Age of Lies. And we're ending our book talk series here this year. We're honored to have Professor Kathleen Jamieson here to discuss her most recent and award-winning book, Cyberwar, How the Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect the President. What we don't, can't, and do know. So thank you for being here. Before I introduce Professor Jamieson and Professor Finkelstein, I just want to take a couple seconds to talk about the center a little bit. We're a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, democratic governance, conflict, and war. CERL draws from the study of philosophy, law, and ethics to unite scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to probe the critical national security and rule of law issues through the lens of ethics and rule of law. Each year we hold a book talk series, which this is our last this year, and we host a series of one-day and two-day conferences where we bring together leading experts to discuss pressing rule of law, ethics, and national security issues. We also run a summer internship program here at the law school during the summer for graduate level students, where we attempt to instill ethics and rule of law values in the next generation of national security leaders. Lastly, we publish a variety of written materials. Our Oxford University Press series on ethics, national security, and the rule of law, of which the volumes are out there on the table for book sales. We have a blog, the Rule of Law Post, where we publish writings from students and experts on ethics and rule of law issues. And we have a variety of policy papers that are intended to influence policymakers in the right ethical and rule of law direction. So if you're interested in learning more about the center, please visit our website. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. Or you can always reach out to me personally via email. So, on to tonight's event. I'd like to take a minute to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Kathleen Jamieson. Professor Jamieson is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor at the Annenberg School of Communication here at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's also the director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Professor Jamieson has authored or co-authored 16 books. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society and a distinguished scholar on the National Communications Association. Professor Jamieson is also a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the International Communications Association. For her contributions to the study of political communication, she received the American Political Science Association's Murray Edelman Distinguished Career Award in 1995, and has done a lot more distinguished work since. And in 2016, the American Philosophical Society awarded her its Henry Allen Moe Prize in the Humanities. So again, thank you for being here. We're honored to host you for this book talk. Professor Claire Finkelstein, as many of you know, is the founder of, she's the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. In 2019, she was named a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. An expert in the law of armed conflict, military ethics, and national security law, she's the co-editor of the Oxford series in Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law. And in in 2012, she founded the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law and continues to be our faculty director and lead us into the future this instead. So when you're leaving, I'm sorry it wasn't set up when you came in, but when you're leaving, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book that is the subject of this series, or take any materials about CERL, it's on a table right outside before you go up the stairs. And with that, I'll turn over the program. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for inviting me. The book Cyberwar is not using the word cyberwar in any legal sense. Let me start by saying, I know that in the national security community, there's real concern that, let's talk about that, one uses it with a kind of care, recognizing there's a gray zone in which very important people are trying to figure out what it should actually mean. I'm using the term cyberwar here as a rhetorical device. In one of the readings that we created for an earlier conference that you did, one of the lawyers called it the figure of speech use of cyberwar. But I used it that way for a reason. I was concerned that the verb that was being used to describe the Russian interventions was meddled. And the strong verb was intervention or interference. And those are verbs that are just too quiet. They're just too unexciting. They're just verbs that don't suggest that we ought to be really worried about something. And so cyberwar was a rhetorical framing device for me to say, I want people to think about this as an attack, not meddling. The response to meddling should be mind your own business. An attack in which capacities were being weaponized. And I'm using weaponized here literally in the means, as saying a means of using them as a weapon. And there are enough analogies to traditional uses of war that I don't think that I'm using it illegitimately, although I'm using it as a rhetorical device. So this is a nation state acting against another nation state. At the point at which we say the Russians did it, we don't mean random Russians. We mean that there's an accusation about a state actor here. So it's cross-national. Secondly, this is an attack on critical infrastructure. And by critical infrastructure, I mean our electoral structure. And we know as of yesterday that all 50 states experienced an attack on their election systems. Now, it doesn't mean that vote levers were changed or vote counts were changed, although we don't actually know that didn't happen, but our national security people don't surmise it did based on the available evidence. But nonetheless, that constitutes critical infrastructure. And there's one other point of analogy that I think is important, at least to me. When you're engaged in the traditional kind of war involving lethal forms of force, when you gain ground, what you try to do quickly is take over the communication system in order to use it to communicate your message through that system. Now, the Russians didn't manage to take over the communication system, but they sure did hijack it pretty effectively. And what the book argues is there are three separable kinds of communication effects potentially in that system. The first, the trolls, the Russian marauders in cyberspace, changed the messaging environment by increasing the amount of message of a certain sort over another form of message. That is, there's a message imbalance that did not exist before they came into cyberspace, and it's imbalances in messages, more on one side than the other, that can change votes on the margin. Two, they hacked content which was passed into our media stream through WikiLeaks, relevant today for other reasons, but that because of the complicity of our media, which did not do a very good job, managed to change the media agenda in ways that altered the message balance against Hillary Clinton, and again, altering message balances on the margin can swing votes. And we know a second thing from the communication literature, and this is historic communication literature, some of which I contributed to, that two things have the capacity to happen in a communication environment that are not usually well understood. When you get more messaging on one side, and more messaging, particularly if it disadvantages one side, what you get are shifts of vote. And when you get a message imbalance, you have a capacity to change the agenda on which people vote. So we all think that we consider all the available issues when we're going to make a cast a vote, but we actually don't. We feature some things more so than others, and that range narrows depending on which are more salient inside our message environment. And so the theory underlying this book is, if you get a message imbalance, because you do it with the trolls, and you get it with the hackers in the mainstream media, and also conservative media, and in that environment, you are shifting the messages toward messages that with susceptible voters advantage Donald Trump, you'll have the capacity to mobilize them. If you shift the balance of messages toward those voters you want to demobilize against Hillary Clinton, by stressing, for example, accurate information, hence the focus on disinformation being mislabeled. That is, make it more salient for black voters that she did use the term super predator. It's not inaccurate to say that, she did. And make more salient the increase in black incarceration during Bill Clinton's administration. Make those things more salient, and what you do is depress the likelihood that black voters are going to cast a vote. On the mobilizing front, if evangelical Christians who are white and white conservative Catholics vote, the likelihood they're going to vote for a Republican is very high. They're not that happy with the idea of voting for Donald Trump, however, as of August, and the percent that are going to vote for Donald Trump projected forward in August is the percent that actually votes for him in November. He loses the Electoral College. Military households and veterans are overwhelmingly going to vote Republican. If they vote, they're going to vote Republican 9 out of 10 times, highly, highly likely. But you can think of all the reasons they're not that happy about voting for Donald Trump. Attacks on John McCain's heroism, attacks on the Gold Star family, and multiple draft deferments for a transient bone spur, among other potential causes. So you look at that and you look at the vulgarity on Howard Stern, the 3 marriages, and then you've got that Access Hollywood tape, and you can see some problems with white evangelical Christians, white conservative Catholics, and you've got these military households not too happy either. And Hillary Clinton, by the way, doesn't have a bad record with military on those issues, head-to-head on issues. She can make a pretty strong case that she's done more for the military than Donald Trump has. So mobilize by changing the issue agenda with them, and you might get those votes up to the level he needs. Now, he's going to do that too. He's going to be out there trying to do that too. The question is, can you increment it up additionally and account for 78,000 votes in 3 key states? And if you can, then you've got a troll explanation. Can you demobilize the black vote? Hillary Clinton didn't have to carry the African American vote at historical levels. She simply had to carry the vote at a level that was substantially below Barack Obama's, but not at a 20-year low. The African American vote is cast at a 20-year low. There's a demobilization going on there. Now, some of that might have been other voter suppression. There might have been other factors, but we know the trolls were active trying to do that. So my theory of the case, that's the only lost term I use, I don't have any idea what that actually means for your context, is that if you up the message imbalance and you shift the considerations in the direction of mobilizing on behalf of Trump with those 2 key constituencies against Hillary Clinton with the African American voters, mobilization, demobilization, and anything you need to shift that's a residual goes to Jill Stein, you potentially create an electoral effect. And you do the same thing in the hacked environment with material that changes the agenda. The book shows you the charts and graphs to show that really happened. We also have statistical data that shows that on those message dimensions that were featured from the hacked content taken out of context by our US media, necessary cause, Russia sufficient cause, media didn't do their job, Hillary Clinton is disadvantaged at a statistical level which against the historical norms projects a vote change that's big enough to change the outcome of the election, hence the hacking effect. I want, before turning over to a conversation, to just show you a little bit of what the troll content looked like. I know some of you are very familiar, but I wanted to make sure for those of you who are not that you had a chance to see it. They were trying to rile cultural change. They're trying to make people very unhappy about it. What happens if people feel discordant with their culture? They're more likely to vote against the incumbent, and the incumbent's heir apparent. Here are some illustrations. Now you know why I'm not reading this out loud. Here's my theory on trolls. Again, I'm just going to show you some illustrations. This is to try to aggregate the audience. Once you can identify the audience, the lookalike function in the platforms lets you identify audiences like that audience. As a result, you expand your capacity to reach the target audience. You like and share. I know you've done it. I now can find people like you in order to reach with subsequent messaging. Make issues more salient. Demobilize black voters. more activity on the Blacktivist site than on the Black Lives Matter site. Those people who say there wasn't enough activity to make a difference should think carefully about the implications of that. More activity on @10_GOP, which is a Russian troll site pretending to be Tennessee Republicans, than on the actual site of the Tennessee Republicans. Part of this is finding and identifying the audience so that you can engage in subsequent messaging. Now we're moving to the subsequent messaging. Here's the demobilization. Here's the demobilization. Here's the inaccurate information tied to the demobilization. Here's the inaccurate information tied to the demobilization. Using the capacities of social media, messages inside the US structure legally there were leveraged. This is a legally purchased ad by a political action committee in the United States.
There's so much at stake in this election, and that's why I'm supporting Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is honest and trustworthy, and can we cut?
Cut. What's the problem?
I can't say these words.
What do you mean?
I just don't believe what I'm saying.
Okay, but you're an actress.
I'm not that good of an actress. Honest and trustworthy. Give me a break. Make America #1 is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Illegally purchased US generated content. Sponsored by Defeat Crooked Hillary Clinton PAC. That's backed by Steve Bannon's championing billionaire Robert Mercer. They've since split. Breitbart, run by Bannon, features the same still photo from the video that is featured by the Russian troll account @10_GOP. Those are our Russian friends pretending to be Tennessee Republicans. They shared their ad and were retweeted by Michael Flynn. Shift to Stein. You might say, why not shift to Gary Johnson? He's got a bigger natural constituency. And the answer is, there's a greater alliance between Jill Stein's issue positions and the Russian government. Here's what the appeals look like. You can see it's an appeal to Sanders supporters. Those themes are alive with Sanders supporters. Themes. If you look at Sputnik and you look at RT, formerly known as Russia Today, which, by the way, I'm pleased to say has attacked my book twice, what you find is that you've got a high level of content about Jill Stein and the Green Party. Here's what the appeals look like. And this would suggest there's some kinship between Jill Stein and Putin. You've seen this picture before. You saw it every time the indictment of Michael Flynn was discussed in mainstream news. There he is, there Putin is, and there's Jill Stein. The roles of hackers and trolls in US press in the election is something we will now discuss. I just wanted to give you some visuals. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for that, Kathleen. And those visuals are amazing and pretty incredible. So walk us through a little bit your methodology here. You make some strong claims, strong claims about causation, which are still very much up for grabs in
Sure.
sort of mainstream circles. Walk us through the methodology of the book and why you feel that you really have a handle on the question of impact.
Now, the conventional wisdom is it could not have mattered. And if it did, we can't know it. And my argument is it could have mattered because we know enough about how messaging has functioned in past elections to know what kind of messaging imbalances and shifts in agenda are required to shift voters on the margin. And we know that because by historical happenstance, and this is the reason I wrote this book that I did not plan to write, we were the ones who worked the rolling cross-sectional method into electoral politics in academia. The rolling cross-sectional method puts you in the field every day with a rolling cross-sectional survey. That means every day is an independently drawn random sample. So instead of aggregating 5 days to a cross-section, which means you don't know whether day 1, day 2, day 3 produced your effect, you're pulling them all together as if there's no difference. And then waiting, and then looking at another cross-section with day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, being treated as if they're fundamentally the same. The rolling cross-sectional method takes a cross-section every single day, a fresh cross-section. It's very expensive. We ran that in 2000, 2004, and 2008. National Annenberg Election Survey is my baby. Richard Johnson from Canada was the other person who worked with us on this, and Michael Hagan, now at Temple University, was the third. And what we, as a result, were able to do by happenstance in 2000, where you'll remember the popular vote went one way and the Electoral College went the other. Before we had social media, when we only had mainstream media, but it still was aggregating very large audiences, was to see what happens when you create message imbalances in two different places. In the general election, in the last week, because of a DUI conviction that previously had not been revealed, George W. Bush, he stays out of network news with one day's exception, even as network news is giving both candidates the option for extended interviews with very large national audiences. And what that means is you have a message imbalance. Gore is on air, Bush doesn't want to be talking about a DUI, and he stays out. And I can look at every single day and ask what's the effect of the message stream, because we've got a rolling cross-sectional analysis going. And what we see is Gore gains on the issue that he features, which is really important, because what that says is the message was what was in the imbalance. It's not simply the imbalance, but was on a message. And it went like this. If you'll remember 2000, and some of us do, it was a year in which at issue was what the Republicans called personal savings accounts, and what the Democrats said was privatization of Social Security. And what that meant for Bush was he was going to take a piece out of the payroll stream and let you invest it in the market. Something that looked like a much worse idea in 2008, and many people were very grateful that we hadn't put it in place in 2008 and the market tanked. But nonetheless, the market was doing really well in 2000, and it was a plausible idea to increase solvency. So that was what was at issue. And what Gore was contending was he's shortchanging the Social Security stream. And as a result, the money isn't going to be there for people when they need it. And he's absolutely right. Unless, of course, everybody's got all this extra private money because they're doing so well in the stock market, in which case they're not going to need to worry about it. But that's the argument. He gets to make it for a week virtually unrebutted, and what we see is on that issue he gains traction, and that shifts votes. So how do I know that when you get the media agenda, you create an imbalance, and you're on an issue that's potentially salient, you can narrow the electorate to focus on it in the way that shifts votes? We saw it happen. But meantime, why did he not win the Electoral College? Because Gore had spent his money too early. He's taken campaign finance restrictions, they both have, and he's on the last week short of money. He under-advertises Bush in the battleground on this issue. Bush comes back in the battleground on this issue and blunts the news effect by saying, I'm not going to do that, everything's going to be fine. Let me show you all these people who say everything's going to be fine. Seniors, don't worry, you're just going to be fine. As a result, he's got enough of an imbalance in the ad stream to blunt the news effect, and he's able to carry the Electoral College.
So
now, that's the theory underlying this.
So let me take you back to the 2016 election. So, and I just want to stay for another minute on the topic of impact.
Yep.
Okay, the impact of all this, because you make such a powerful case on the methodology, on the motives, and in particular that sequence that you just showed us. It's really extraordinary to see the kind of potential intentionality and the relationship of the different types of ads to one another. But let's just sort of go to the end of the story before we go back to the beginning, which is how do we get a handle on the question of impact? Now, in part 4, you talk about what we can't know, right? But I'd just like you to talk a little bit about potential effects in 2 areas. And one is voter suppression, right? And you showed some important slides about voter suppression. And the other areas, of course, decreasing enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton, increasing enthusiasm for now President Trump. Can you talk a little bit about how we start to get a handle on the level of impact on those 2 questions? Even though you say we can't know it, how can we sort of gauge the scale of effects from the types of techniques that you talk about?
Okay, the first question is, what could the trolls do? And there's a big set of what-ifs before you can say the trolls could make a difference. First, they have to have enough messaging. If they don't have enough messaging, it's not going to matter. They have a lot more messaging than we thought at first. It turns out it wasn't just 126 million people who were affected. By the time you look at all the downstream, you're up substantially above that number. And you look at all the places that they were active, and you're substantially above those numbers. So that's the first thing. If they don't have enough messaging, it's not going to matter. Secondly, their theory of the election has to be sound. And the reason I wrote this book was I was asked by one of my former students to write an op-ed when the platforms first put the ads out, made the ads available to the congressional committees in late October, early November 2017. And she said, well, Kathleen Jamieson will know whether that could have created an impact. So the Washington Post said, Kathleen Jamieson, can you write an op-ed about whether it created an impact? And I didn't expect to think the answer was yes until I looked at the ads and said, their theory of the election was sound. You have to be messaging in ways consistent with Trump's needs. Or it doesn't matter. You can have lots of messaging, but it's not going to accomplish the effect. So that's the second thing. It has to be strategically sound content, visually evocative content that gets shared with others. Well, the amount of sharing is very high, in part because this is such visually evocative content. So persuasion theory would say this was pretty good stuff if it reaches the right target audience, and they've got the lookalike functions, et cetera. Their targeting to get to these audiences was there. Here's what we don't know. Did it get to the key people who needed to be swung in 3 key battleground states? We don't have the answer to that. The platforms do, they haven't released it. If you were on Twitter and you touched Russian content, they actually let you know after the election that you got Russian content. They know where you are, reasonably. And it's a little hard to get you geolocated, but reasonably they know where you are. I can't, as a result, on trolls say they did produce an impact. I can say they could. On hacking, it's all in public view. So I can look at what happens when hacked content comes into our news media. Remember, necessary but not sufficient. Press access is what makes it sufficient. And I can show you the agenda change. I can show you charts there in the book that show the Access Hollywood tape got relatively little staying power. That should have ended his candidacy, by the way, by reasonable historical expectations. Bob Woodward argues in his book that the Republican High Command was looking at moving Pence up to the presidential nomination and putting Condoleezza Rice in as the VP nominee. Republicans fled him in droves until the end of that weekend when the Podesta hacked content comes into the news stream on the same day at which at the beginning of the day, the Department of Homeland Security and Director of National Intelligence have confirmed it was the Russians. Access Hollywood tape is released, and within an hour, and here's the suspicion of somebody talking to Julian Assange to tell him it was time to drop this, hence Roger Stone, potentially, that drops within an hour as well. In that kind of an environment, what you've got is the media agenda is being changed by the hacked content to blunt the impact of the Access Hollywood tape, which otherwise potentially could have ended the candidacy right there. And we see as the hacked content from the Podesta hacks is released week after week after week, where the Access Hollywood tape has very little staying power. You keep an upward spike that continues to move forward because the hacked content continues to stay in news. And what it does is changes the amount of scandal coverage about Hillary Clinton and creates the message imbalance that you can actually see inside the media structures. There are 3 different content analyses that show that. I've got them all documented in the book. But the most important piece of this is we've got survey data. So we have cross-section, not rolling cross-section. After the deplorables content has been put in place, after she says basket of deplorables, that happened in September. After she said it was just allergies when it was pneumonia, that's September. It's in a period in which nothing bad happens to her other than she's got 2 debates and the hacked content. And in that break period, after the Access Hollywood tape comes into the news stream, you can watch across that period. Donald Trump doesn't get hurt by it on major dimensions in our survey data, but the perception that she is competent to be president, qualified to be president, drops at a statistically significant level. And that drop happens before the Comey announcement that the Anthony Weiner laptop may have classified information. He's trying to find that out. So what accounts for that drop during that period, given my theory about how imbalances work and no other evidence that suggests something's hurting her in the environment? Plausible theory is it's the hacked content. And then secondly, this is a tighter analysis than that. What kind of content comes into the media stream that looks like that Gore Social Security argument, where I can actually tie a message? A speech that she gives that comes into public domain with the Podesta hacked content on October 7th, 2 days before the second debate. The debate is the 9th. Has her saying, in the context of talking about Steven Spielberg's film about Lincoln, that sometimes you take a public position and a private position that may differ. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the sense. There's an intact sentence in which she says public and private position. It is taken out of the context of her discussion of the Lincoln film. It is treated by the president or political opponents as if she confessed to Wall Street banks that she was taking a different position with them than she was taking in public. There's no evidence that that happened anywhere in the hacked context. And it stands in for that in not only the news stream, remember, now we have intact language, public and private position, but a question is phrased in the second debate by Martha Raddatz that quotes it verbatim, but not in the context of the film. She tries to put it back inside the debate. Now remember, I now have exact language. And then a second piece of content is taken out of context, also from the Podesta hack, released on the 7th. And this is in the third debate, the 19th. This is Chris Wallace, who, like the news anchors all day the 9th, when the first Podesta hack is being publicly treated, takes the sentence out of context, and here's what her sentence says, that she stands for open trade and open borders sometime in the future, and then the rest of that sentence, no period, talks about energy transfer. There's nothing in that sentence that has a word about immigration or refugees. Trump makes it out to be immigration or refugees and says, she's been saying she doesn't support open borders. See, she admitted it. And you fact checkers, you're wrong, because in private she admitted it. In private she said no such thing. They're taking a sentence out of context and putting a
Right.
period where it wasn't. And in our survey, studying debate viewers, comparing viewers to non-viewers in the presence of controls, those who watched either of the two debates are more likely to say she says one thing in private, another thing in public, and that is to predict at a statistically significant level a reduced likelihood to vote.
So Kathleen, this ties in with a theme that you stress is really important for us to discuss, which is the mainstream media's use and amplification of the Russian material. To what do we attribute that? Is this just a liability of the media? Is it a special liability these days with a kind of echo chamber effect of media copying media? Is it the decrease in investigative journalism so that people aren't doing first-hand reporting? Are we at a special point of vulnerability for the amplification of foreign content?
Well, first, reporters love hacked content. They love leaked content. They love things that are secret, because then they can reveal them. And so there's the assumption, and it's not illegitimate, that if someone's not releasing something, maybe they have something to hide. So Hillary Clinton made one really stupid decision. Well, she made many stupid decisions, but she made one really stupid decision. When Bernie Sanders first called for those speeches to be released, she should have released them. The press would have vetted the heck out of them. Sanders would have gained some ground by quoting things like private, public, and then the press would have said, but wait a minute, that's in the context of a film. Let's look at all the rest of these speeches and see if she actually gave any Wall Street assurances that she was going to gut Dodd-Frank. She didn't. You would have had the same thing with open trade, open borders. There would have been a brief moment which people would have said, oh, look. And then the fact checkers would have come in to say, as they did say after the debate, look, that's not what the sentence says, and none of the other speeches support this alternative interpretation that she's going to let
Right, so
refugees
why doesn't that
put
happen?
in.
I mean,
So
sort of, what's the vulnerability
The press
here?
likes hacked, leaked, secret content. And there was such a strong narrative of her hiding something with what that meant coming out of the Democratic primaries, that given the rush of this hacked content, with thousands of things being dumped on the press every week, with the news cycle, everything else coming in rapidly at them, they just took the existing narrative and overlaid it and didn't pay enough attention to keep it in context. They also didn't treat the hacked content as being Russian in origin, even though they knew as of October 7th it was. And they should have done that, because remember October 7th, 3 stories, Russians did it, Access Hollywood, and then Podesta hacked. They should have taken Russian did it and attached to the Podesta hack and said Russian hacked content given by Julian Assange through WikiLeaks. If they had said that, we would have asked, why do the Russians want to affect the election? Why do they want to help Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? Do they? Intelligence community, and you talked to Michael Hagan, hey, how do you know this? Aren't you just in the tank for Barack Obama? It would have been really vetted to see, do we really know this? But they also would have said, why doesn't Julian Assange want her elected? Oh yes, she wants him imprisoned. So now you'd keep source tied to message in a way that would have put the Russian piece into this, in the assessment of the content. Secondly, they didn't say they hadn't independently verified. And in retrospect, they say, well, the Clinton people never successfully challenged that it was wrong. That doesn't change the press norm. You're supposed to say you haven't independently verified when you haven't. Third, they made scandals out of things that in retrospect aren't scandals. They had no staying power, and then they took things out of context. They violated just journalist norms, and now your question, they were so overwhelmed with all of this content, which hadn't happened to them before. They didn't have good journalistic rules in place to know how to deal with it. They dealt with it too quickly. They weren't as careful as they should have been. And in retrospect, my worry about 2020 is in part, hope those voting machines are secured and they've got paper access ballots and they're trying to protect registration with registration backups every day, et cetera. But I also think the platforms have done a lot to protect us. I don't think the press has done a whole lot, at least not public, telling us what they would have done differently.
So is that a matter of changing journalistic norms, or is it a matter of legislation, or is it a matter of greater transparency with regard to the platform so that the journalists know what they're dealing with? What is it, how does one get at that?
No, first, on the press front, I'm a First Amendment absolutist, as close as you're going to get, outside the law school. I remember Ed Baker was here, and I loved Ed Baker. The government should stay away from all of this. Press should do its job. Press has all kinds of good protections. Press should be self-reflective, but press should do its job. And other press should do its job holding press accountable. And I'm alarmed that they're not telling us how they're going to do it. The next hacking may be against a Republican. It might maybe a senator on candidate.
Well, in fact, the Republicans supposedly were hacked, or at least there was an attempted hack. So why didn't we see release from the RNC? Why only DNC material?
Ask Vladimir Putin. But you asked another question, which is, what about the platforms? The platforms have taken steps. They are trying to close what they call inauthentic accounts, which is a somewhat strange way of characterizing them. They are also trying to ensure that you can't buy ads if you're a foreign national. It's illegal to do that. But ads were bought with rubles. So they just weren't expecting this to happen. Now they've got systems set up so that you have to show an ID that's US based, like a business number or a social security number. There's a mail back process in place. They also now are on YouTube, where a lot of this content got traction, including a lot of ROT content, placing on the screen, but the lower part of the screen where you're less likely to see it, the disclaimer that says this is government funded. That means our PBS, by the way, has, I noticed that it's got some government funding as well. I'd like there to be a lot more. I'd like it to have a tie to government that's so great that it has to have a great big fat disclosure. So they're trying to increase the likelihood you know the source tied to the message. All those things are very positive.
Now, I take it they're not going to be adequate, however, because it's always possible for the Russians to find an intermediary.
Or the Iranians or the Chinese or...
I mean, if they give money to the NRA and the NRA purchases the ads.
Yeah, I mean, we have to worry about all of the ways in which this is going to migrate and not only try to fight the last war. But for practical purposes, making sure we've at least blocked everything we can is helpful. The government reaction to this is also, I think, something that we ought to think about. I mean, President Obama put in place sanctions. He did it at the end of December. It didn't stop the activity. The platforms moved against the content, and the Russians simply moved off to Instagram. So as things were closed down on Facebook, as they started to tighten up on Twitter, they shifted off to Instagram. That didn't stop them. Then the CATSA sanctions went in, passed by Congress with the veto-proof majority. The CATSA sanctions come in. That doesn't stop the Russians either. So, well, they seem to be awfully upset about sanctions. It appears that's what they were trying to get out from under as they were trying to negotiate in this environment. They don't appear to be doing much to discourage them from continuing to engage in the activity. Then we hacked back. So in 2018, the government hacked back. And the question is, did that provide enough of a signal in order to dampen this activity down? The government appears to be telling us that it may have through its back channels, but I bet most of you know more about that than I do. What else can a government do under these circumstances? A cyber treaty? I don't know.
So let's go back for a moment and distinguish the propaganda issues, which you've so beautifully outlined and which your book talks about so well, from the hacking issues. Because at least to a security and a legal community, those fall into two very different camps. And indeed, when you talk about, when you use the label cyber war, we come much closer to having something that resembles a cyber attack, which for purposes of armed conflict, what we want to know is whether or not an act in cyberspace can constitute an armed attack in order to constitute an act of war. We're not going to get that with the propaganda. So the grief that you've gotten from the security folks on that front is well founded to some extent, but on the hacking issues, you come much closer to having what looks like a violation of international sovereignty, a legitimate act to which a right of self-defense might be responsive, et cetera, et cetera. Yet from your description, it looks as though the propaganda might have been more damaging. Right? What's your sense of that?
We don't know. I mean, I can make a stronger case for the hacking simply because the evidence that I use is all publicly accessible evidence, and I have polling data. We will know if we ever get the revelation about whether the micro-targeting was into the key states, and we just don't know. We know they could have gotten there, by the way, without anything that was based on a conspiracy with the Trump campaign. So a big problem I've had with this book is people are confusing a Trump argument about conspiracy with an argument about impact. They are completely separable for this reason. The Russians didn't need any help. They had three things. They hacked the Democratic playbook. They knew where they needed to move. The question is, could they be smart enough to get there? Secondly, the social media platforms are built to sell us to advertisers. And as a result, my 11-year-old grandson, our 11-year-old grandson, my husband's in the back with her, ours, he's yours too, our 11-year-old grandson can figure out how to micro-target, where you needed special skills in the time-buying era and broadcast to do it, you don't anymore. And then our mainstream media spends so much time on tactical coverage and making us good campaign consultants by telling us where the candidate needs to go to put the advertising, what voters the person needs to reach. And I've got pages in the book that simply quote what amounts to a guidebook to somebody to figure out how to influence the electorate as a result. With those three channels and the ability to trail the Trump campaign in through social media to states it needs to influence, they didn't need any help. It doesn't mean they didn't get it or did, but they didn't need it.
Nevertheless, the indictments of the 12 Russians or 13 Russians
13.
mentions assistance from U.S. persons.
It does.
Correspondence with U.S. persons, okay? So whether they needed the help or not, there's some evidence that there were U.S. persons that they were relying on, and whether or not the evidence is there to make out a case of conspiracy or not.
But some of those persons could be the people who put a Hillary Clinton-like figure in a cage at a rally. The person
That's right.
who sponsored a rally thinking they were helping a local group, and, et cetera. So that those persons are Trump-tied is an open question.
Right. Oh, we don't know that,
Yeah.
right? And we may know more when we see the Mueller report. Presumably we will, depending on how much of it we see. But once again, going back to the distinction though between the hacking, which is what the indictments are based on, and propaganda effects, the chances that we're going to be able to actually eliminate foreign propaganda effects, and which is really an extension of good old-fashioned covert operations, some of which we've engaged in, and you note that in your book, sort of how that argument is used.
And Putin uses that argument.
And Putin uses that argument, exactly. What are the chances we're ever going to get rid of the propaganda effect? And my worry is that, in fact, it's that, which you so powerfully show, that is likely to be much more impactful when we're talking about voter suppression, when we're talking about sort of changing voters' minds very close to an election, than the release of compromising material.
Yeah, I mean, first, the answer in my book is probably, not certainly. So on the trolls, I say we ultimately can't know. I can make the case that they have the capacity. I can't get the targeting argument. I don't have the evidence. On the hacking, I can make a pretty credible case, but it is based on a whole set of assumptions about how history and communication has worked in the past and the analogy to the present. There is a third argument in the book about Russian disinformation, which suggests that the possibility exists that James Comey's decision to make public the reopened investigation in October may have been in part influenced by Russian disinformation. So there are three channels, not two, involved in this. But are we ever going to be able to eliminate? Probably not. But we can minimize the likelihood by being more aware of its presence and taking all precautions that are possible. I don't think it's as long as it's in the self-interest of someone else to engage in this activity, and we don't put strong enough responses up in place to discourage it, that we're ever going to eliminate it. And I don't think the Russians are the only worry.
No.
I think we should worry about other nations as well, and we should worry about the same sorts of things happening domestically. The Democrats did it, in the Roy Moore case. So they put up false content, pretended they were someone else. They pretended they were teetotaling Baptists.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. So two arguments against your worry or against your position here. One is propaganda goes on all the time domestically. Why are we more worried about foreign propaganda than about domestic propaganda?
Actually, I'm not. I mean, my first response to this, I did an interview and I was on sabbatical and I was not thinking about this as a book at all. In fact, I wasn't thinking about this at all. Was the person who was interviewing me on a radio broadcast, and he was very worried about this. And I said, if all they did was put more of the same stuff that was already out there into the media stream, yeah, I don't like deception in the media stream, But, we deal with that all the time. What's the problem? And I realized 3 months later when I was writing the book that the problem is you can get message imbalances out of it. That's the problem. The problem isn't the nature of it, it's the extent of it. And so in theory, what you would do is you'd counter with the comparable extent, you'd blunt the effect. And so that's an issue of resources and money and strategic savvy.
So, but can we get that domestically as well? We get the same
Sure.
kind of message. In fact, that's what, candidates are trying to do all the time, is to create just that kind of message imbalance, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually the reason for my first response, which was, I run factcheck.org. Yeah, we see this all the time. And as far as I can see, the stuff looks as if it's just US stuff amplified up. I'm not that worried about it. It was my first response. Capacity to change, message imbalance, in this case, I would argue, had the possibility of making a difference. Does that mean that we ought to worry about in the future? Only if we want to worry about foreigners doing it.
Well, so that's my question to you. What is the basis for worrying more about the, Russians creating message imbalance than worrying about extremist groups in the US creating
Yeah, I'm
message?
not. I mean, for practical purposes, I'm not. My argument is it potentially mattered. Now, whether you don't want to worry about it or not is a separable question. I am worried about hacked content released in and the media not doing its job, in part because it creates an asymmetry between the candidates, and in part because it was strategically deployed in ways that were extremely artful, but in part because the media didn't do its job, and if it had done its job, it probably couldn't have created the effect. So this is not a book that is saying Hillary Clinton should have been elected. It's a book that says, I'm looking at this environment and saying these things could have mattered, and we might have had a different president as a result.
So the second argument that you hear all the time is, you describe yourself as a First Amendment absolutist, but in
Pretty
fact
close.
there are
Pretty
positions
close.
that are stronger than yours out there.
Yes, pretty close.
Which say, look, who cares if it's foreign, domestic, it's a marketplace of ideas, right? And what difference does it make if a Russian professor writes a compelling book that changes people's minds and makes them think about things differently than to have ads put out there on Facebook and messages put out there on Twitter? And so do we really want to suppress speech or?
I'm actually worried about that. I'm worried about in the process of trying to control this, that other speech may be suppressed that is actually legitimately coming out of our political system here. But I think one of the questions is, what do you want people to know about the propaganda, both domestic and foreign? I want to know who's telling me. So I think I'm with Anton Scalia on this one. I believe in disclosure. And I think disclosure is an appropriate requirement of content providers. I think they ought to voluntarily do it. And Facebook is actually trying to do that now with its content. It's trying to disclose not only what the content is, but it's also trying to disclose what the source of the content is.
So
I think source and message need to be tied, and we make better judgments. And I prefer to encourage the disclosure and then let us make a judgment about whether we want to accept it or not, than to try to find ways to suppress.
And by the way, that same structure and those same kinds of safeguards go into things like trying to beef up controls around the Foreign Agent Registration Act, so that it's one thing to have foreign lobbying, it's another thing to not know that these are foreign lobbying.
Well, RT is now required to register under the Foreign Agent
Registration Act, right, exactly.
And one of the things that is interesting about watching RT is we have it in most of our living rooms, in most of our cable systems. We have it in most of our hotel rooms. And most of the time when you're watching it, you wouldn't know it was Russian. It's RT, which means retweet in the social media sphere. You knew it was called Russia Today, because much of it, including the fact that Ed Schultz was on air, formerly MSNBC, now deceased, but very alive in 2016. Larry King, formerly CNN. A lot of this looks like mainstream US content. So the fact that that registration is there, and the fact that YouTube is putting the identity, at least lets us say, I know who's talking to me. And we've known since Aristotle, that people use source to judge messages. It's an important piece of information. So tell me who you are and propagandize the heck out of me. And maybe you may say, I love Russians. The fact that the Kremlin is talking to me, terrific. I am now going to do whatever they want. That's fine with me too. I would just like to know it's you.
So let's just go to one more area, and then we'll let the audience in for to expand the discussion, which is a number of European countries have been more successful than we have been in combating Russian attempts to influence their elections. So the French, notoriously, and have were able to fight off very intense efforts on the part of the Russians. A lot of money was put into far-right candidates and so on. None of that was successful. One of the things that you find in Europe is there is not the strong First Amendment tradition that we have. And in fact, the French have a ban on reporting, I think it's 36 hours prior to an election.
And they put a warning up when the hacked content was released, which we could not do here.
Right,
So
right.
their regulatory structure basically warned the media, if you put anything inaccurate up there, it comes out of hacked content, you're accountable. But we can't do that.
Right,
Nor I would
we can't
argue
do
should
that.
we, by the way.
Well, that's my question to you. So, you know, how do you balance your concerns to try to control the impact of this propaganda versus, you know, wanting that marketplace of ideas to be protected, as well as particularly protecting the press?
Yeah, no, I want the press to do its job. It's that simple. And I mean, I exist as an academic in part in space, which works to try to get the press to do a better job at being the press. Because I think our system's ingenious in the way in which it's got that protection there so that that institution can hold those in power accountable. The problem is when it is turned to other ends because it doesn't do its job, it also has an enormous capacity for influence. And I wouldn't solve that by having government touch it.
Well, that would be, so that would be your argument around governmental suppression of freedom of the press.
Yeah.
What about self-imposed norms? And we have lots of examples of those in the journalistic community. For example, journalists may, but they typically will not, publish the names of rape victims or publish the names of children who have been the victim of crimes and so on. And these are very effective self-imposed norms that the press has come to over the years without being legally required to do it. Would you favor trying to come up with a, you know, sort of journalistic canon of ethics that would partly control for the way that journalists handle?
But see, they already have it. I mean, that's the irony. I mean, everything I articulate is a journalistic norm. Source your content. Indicate whether you've independently verified it. Don't create scandals that don't exist, and keep things in context. That you don't have to put that in place, that's already there.
But when the New York Times and the Washington Post are vying for a story, wanting to be the first one out with the story, those norms may go out the window, or is that not the source of it?
I mean, I think I think it was Richard Clarke in a subsequent book to his book on Cyberwar, and I know he's upset because he didn't want any other book called Cyberwar. And in retrospect, given the problems I've had with the national security community saying that was the wrong title, I wish I had known that he'd objected, because then I wouldn't have used the word. But one of the things that he argues is the first time something happens, we just aren't able to deal with it. We're just not prepared for it. And he's got a really nice name for it, which I have forgotten. I think part of the problem for the press was they just hadn't dealt with this before. And they were dealing with an election in which there was so much other material that was out there for them to work with, in a process that's already stressed because their commercial model is under real stress, that they just didn't have the resources and they didn't have the time to take the care which largely they take in other kinds of circumstances. So these are journalists I genuinely admire who made these mistakes. This is a one-off for them. This is not their routine pattern of behavior. Some of our best journalists made some mistakes, but they're human. Of course they made mistakes. Under pressure in a consequential moment, the Russians got lucky, because this first-time phenomenon, coupled with all that pressure with our changing media structure, meant that some people didn't do what they ought to, in retrospect, I think, have done, which is at least keep it in context.
Well, now, so last question on journalists. Julian Assange.
Yes.
So has now been indicted. Excuse me, he was previously indicted. The indictment has been unsealed. He's been arrested, turned over to the British. Seems very likely that he'll be extradited to the US. Very interesting, because of course it may be that the Eastern District of Virginia will get some information out of him. We'll see what happens. He potentially knows an awful lot, if there's anything there to know. Interestingly, today, the ACLU came out and objected to his indictment, saying...
Now, this indictment is about the Chelsea Manning
It's about the
case. This is not about
right.
the Russians.
So he's been indicted for conspiracy to basically hack into protected government databases with the purpose of disseminating the information. Manning did it, but the argument is that he's a co-conspirator with Manning. and that's his single count of indictment. And it really puts squarely the question of the scope of the First Amendment protection here, right? So the first obvious question is he a journalist? Is he a member of the press, and should he have protection? And second of all, even if he does count as a member of the press, if he does count, would indictment be appropriate for the encouragement that he may have provided to Chelsea Manning to engage in that kind of hacking?
And I've got the ultimate out, because I am not a lawyer. And in
You're
my
talking to a
judgment,
room
as
full
a
of lawyers?
non-lawyer, my judgment is that's why we have courts. So I think that there's a case on both sides. This is a complex issue, and we have a good system that helps us work this out. And I think we are going to see very smart people arguing multiple sides of this, and at the end, we're going to have another New York Times versus Sullivan kind of moment, where there's going to be some clarity about something. And we as a country, because that's what courts do for us, are going to benefit from the fact that that is protected space in which we still value argument and evidence, and a system that's adversarial and that has good rules and that are enforced and protected across time. And I know there are scholars who say that's a naive view of the courts. Call me naive. I believe the courts will give us a good answer.
All right, so with that, why don't we open the floor to comments and questions? For lots of people, if you want to, I don't know how we want to do this, come up to the mic. Since we have a mic right here, that might be the best. I don't know if we have any roving mics to bring to you, so I think maybe just coming here, or else if you don't feel comfortable, shout out your question and I'll repeat it if it can't be heard. So, yes, sir.
What is the argument with regards to, this is something that nations do. We all spy on one another, and we've been doing it for years. And and we all look into each other's accounts. You know, we've all been doing it for years. So the United States has been guilty of doing this in South America, you know, and all other places, and with dramatic, horrible effects on populations. So, what is this? Okay, I'll just put that out there like that.
Yeah. I think that this is one of those lovely moments in which the nation gets to confront its own hypocrisy and to ask, what are the ethical boundaries that we believe ought to be in place for everyone? And the implication of that is that if we're going to object to it and find it problematic, then it is problematic. How do you then codify that in this gray zone world in a way that increases the likelihood that no one engages in it? Or that there's a penalty sufficiently high that you're at least increasing the likelihood that they think twice or 3 or 4 or 8 times before they engage in it. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the notion that if you look at the United States from the perspective of those around the world, we do not look to them like we look to ourselves with our rhetoric, that we are always the ones who are pure, engaged in righteous activity, and, oh no, they're doing something awful to us as a result of the response, when you can make a plausible case that we are probably engaged in things that are comparable. I
think I can also give you an answer on that, which is, the first time we've had Michael Hayden here twice to speak, and the first time we had him here, I asked him this question, and he said, look, it's what the Russians did is just absolutely standard covert activities. You know, we've done it, other countries do it. It just looks a little bit more intense. The second time he was here, however, he said, we know more now, and my view has evolved, and I think that they were deliberately trying to infiltrate our critical infrastructure, our election. So if you treat election security as part of our critical infrastructure, then at least the hacking activities, as distinguished from the propaganda activities, start to surpass the level of standard covert operations, start to get much closer to the line of violations of sovereignty that really start to look like potential acts of war, armed conflict, with this kind of use of information being weaponized. Yes, sir.
But just 2 comments. A lot of the arguments you make are predicated on the lack of ability of people to analyze that there's something wrong with the message. The very first slide that you showed is very close, the one that you showed, right? The gun thing, right? I see that and I know right away that's almost as bad as a Nigerian email that I won the lottery, right? It's clearly a Russian piece of paper. You can see it right away if you have any knowledge at all of that kind of background. It's the one with the gun at the front. It says, it's easier to get me out of jail than cemetery, right? Now, it should be a cemetery the way we would see it. There's clearly something wrong with that, and that's clearly a Russian way of saying it. Now, so don't we need more,
It's the front.
don't we get more ability to make people more knowledgeable about evaluating what they're seeing rather than trying to stop it from coming in?
Sure, but this is a highly educated group, and that visual is on the screen for about 15 minutes. So the typical person is going to be doing whatever they're doing online, and this pops up, and it doesn't come from somebody you don't know. It comes from a friend who sent it to you because they liked it and linked it. So you're susceptible because you got it from your friend. It's visually evocative, and if they target it well, you already agree with the sentiment. You like and share before you've ever asked, have they suppressed an indefinite or definite article, and hence they're likely to be Russians. So the question is, how do we increase the likelihood that we don't do that? And there's a phenomenon in communication that's called the third person effect. People believe that they're not vulnerable to manipulation, but everybody else is. And we can increase the likelihood that we are less vulnerable. Education should do that. Education in particular fields should do that because it increases the likelihood of high levels of analytic processing. But we should be able, at a much younger age, to get people to think about the social media space as something that they own and that they need to protect. And for those of you who know Justice O'Connor's project, iCivics, raise your hand. We have partnered with them for multiple years. We helped them get that project started because we do a lot of work in the civic space. We've got a project up now, it's called Newsfeed Defenders. It's designed for middle schoolers, and it's an attempt to help them curate their own website, not on political matters, but on health and education matters, so that they ask before they post it, have I checked it? Is it accurate? How do I know it's accurate? What we're trying to do is to get that process increasingly in place in the social media space at a younger age. It doesn't reduce our vulnerability to like-minded processing of congenial content. Things we already agree with, we, not them, we are more likely to think uncritically about, and as a result accept it without looking at it carefully. And so this probably stands out to you because you don't agree with it ideologically and you're counter-arguing it and looking as a result carefully. Imagine that it's on the other side of the issue and it's favoring your bias. The likelihood you're going to share it is extremely high, even if you're me.
Help me find the slide. I managed to get here, but I can't. Couldn't find which slide you meant.
Okay, here we go. This, by the way, is my documentation that the Russians did it. That's all the platforms they were active on. That's their video game, Hiltendo. These are top performers. Notice how visually evocative. Look at their high numbers. It was the first slide in the sequence, and the problem is I can't get back to the sequence. Yeah, I can't get back to the sequence. I can't get back to the sequence and hold it. I can try, but it's not working.
So we have other people who have.
So,
Hello.
how are you?
I'm fine.
The question I have is that you're saying that message volume.
Imbalances in volume. Yes, imbalances in volume, yes.
Isn't it true that the Russians spent like $100,000 for this Facebook messaging, the imbalance? It was like $100,000 when maybe $1 billion was spent in this election altogether. Why couldn't the other side, the Clinton side, or people in favor of Clinton, spend $200,000
They could have.
or $20 million to increase their messaging?
They could.
Why is this a problem?
They could. All I'm arguing is there's a message imbalance created. The $100,000 is only looking at ad expenditure. Most of the impact of the Russians is organic. This is one of the platform ploys to try to say it didn't matter. They try to say, look, they didn't spend any money. That's because the advertising, first you can get a lot of reach out of the advertising, but the organic content is the stuff that proliferated. That was us getting it and then sharing it with everybody else. So the total amount of exposure on the organic side is what's large, not on the advertising side. What the advertising side lets us see is what they were trying to target, because we've got the targeting information underlying the advertising.
So you're saying they spent, how much did they spend on it?
They didn't spend a whole lot. They didn't need to. Although they spent a lot more.
So you can counter it by spending.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is an argument about the effect that was created by an imbalance. How do you counter it? You create a counterbalance. The Clinton people didn't do it.
So, and this raises a very important issue when you put statistics out there like, I think it was 36% of people in the United States can't name one branch of government. I think that was a statistic that you put, which was absolutely shocking to me. Why don't we use social media for good? Why don't we use it for education much more intensely? Why don't we use it to create that love for democracy and knowledge of our system and desire to support checks and balances and everything else?
I mean, that's what Newsfeed Defenders is. That's what the iCivics projects are.
It's
They're an
supposed to be,
attempt to
yeah.
do that. That's what if anybody's interested, go to Annenberg Classroom. That's where our documentaries are on the fundamentals of government. Things that if you understand, you actually are more likely to be committed to our system. So if you don't understand that there are 3 branches, you don't know how a veto functions, you can't name the basic rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, you're less likely to say that if a court issues unpopular decisions, we ought to still keep the court. So basically, if you issue unpopular decisions, it might be okay to get rid of the court. So why are we trying to teach the fundamentals of civics? Because if you don't have them and there's a threat to our system, you're not going to support keeping this system of government, and that's a deep problem. But there's all kinds of civic activity out there that's trying to do this on social media. And I don't want to underplay that. Civics Renewal Network, which we run, has every one of the major civics organizations that produces no-cost, state standards-aligned content in the country. It includes Library of Congress. It includes National Archives. It includes our Annenberg Classroom. It includes Constitution Center. All those groups are trying very hard to do exactly what you want, not simply in social media space, but in life space. And I encourage you to help them get there, by the way. If any of you know a high school teacher or a middle school teacher, or even a college teacher, help them get to good civics material.
So,
Hi.
I'm trying to connect the subject matter of your book and our electoral system. We have a very sophisticated electoral system.
Sophisticated is one way of characterizing it. Yeah.
Well, let me say, high standard, a very like a foolproof sort of election system, and electoral system. And if you remember the elections, we had primaries. The Republicans had 16 primaries. 16 contestants with several debates, spent millions and millions of dollars on targeted advertising, marketing, and so were the Democrats. The Democrats had 2 candidates, and they had the most, and Hillary Clinton had the most sophisticated campaign. And at the end of it, they spent about over $3 billion on the entire election. And all the polling showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. In the background of these details, how can you ever imagine some trolls from some country you claim from spending $100,000 and swinging the election for Donald Trump? Isn't that a stretch?
No, and it isn't, because the media agenda, which is the dominant way in which people get the mass circulated information, was demonstrably changed by the hacked content as used by our media. And we know that agenda setting affects voters. So all that other stuff is in the system already in my analysis. Every stupid thing both candidates did is in. Every smart thing they did, every dollar they spent is already in my argument. And all the question I'm asking is, would the increment up of changing the media agenda dramatically over October, and this increased troll messaging, and potential disinformation that may have influenced Comey's decision in the last 9 of the 11 days of the election, which dramatically changed the electoral equation because she dropped 3 points in the polls, in part because of media exposure to that narrative, were those enough to influence 78,000 votes, 0.0006 of the votes cast? And the answer, I argue, is plausibly yes. So I'm not disputing everything you're saying, it's true. I'm building it all in and asking. See, your analysis bakes the Russians into the denominator, mine doesn't. Mine says bake everything else in and then ask, does all of this put together give you an increment up of 78,000 votes? And if it does, then you got an effect.
Hillary Clinton was leading in the polls. She was leading up to the day of the election, and she lost.
That just says the polls were bad.
And you think some Russian hackers or somewhere spent $100,000 and swing an election where we spent $3 billion. Isn't that a stretch?
No. No, it's not. And I'm not saying did, I'm saying I'm making a case for the plausibility of that impact. So this is not I can make a conclusive case. This is a little more like arguing to a jury in the presence of a whole lot of things that begin to look as if everything points in one direction.
Why do you think the media missed this whole issue, the way you describe it? And having said that, what do you think can be done to stop it from happening again? And or related to that, what do we as citizens, rather than, I mean, obviously you have $150 million to spend on campaigns, you can do certain things, but if you're not that kind of, if you don't have that kind of money, what do you think we as citizens could do about it? And what do you think the media is doing about trying to not make that mistake?
Well, I think I've already said I don't think the media is doing anything that I know about. So I think that's problematic. I think there have been a lot of activities on the platforms that are likely to minimize the impact. I think a major question in all of this is this a one-time phenomenon where everything just coalesced to create a circumstance in which we had vulnerability? And there is one more vulnerability, by the way. Most elections, you get incrementing up of information, and there aren't enough people who are persuasible to make any difference. So you have to have enough people who are open to persuasion, or you can't create an impact. And this year we had 3 phenomena that increased the persuasibility of the electorate. They didn't like either major party nominee. So you could increment up, I dislike this one more, as a way of shifting the vote. We were less anchored in party. There were a higher number of independents. Party identification predicts votes. So if you're an independent, even if you're a leaner and you're an independent, I've got more capacity to influence your votes. And because of those 2 phenomena, and we had early voting happening in large numbers throughout October, short-term communication stimuli can create short-term effects. And early voting, in an environment in which you had susceptible voters, they didn't like either candidate, they weren't as anchored to party, and as a result, in the final week of the election, you had an unprecedented number of undecided voters, which means all of this stuff you're all talking about, all those dollars hadn't moved them to a vote. And in that environment, you have high levels of stimuli controlled by a foreign power for the first time in history. Even if you say it didn't make a difference, you don't think it made a difference, we ought to worry about the possibility that it's going to happen again and ask, what could we do differently? I've listed some things the platforms have done. I've listed some things I think the press ought to do. And on the James Comey front, you have to read the book to find out why I think Russian disinformation influenced him. He won't be there next time. It will be someone else. And I don't think they're going to be vulnerable in the same kinds of ways.
But the interesting thing is, when you think, how could $100,000 have this impact? You partly answer that question in the book by talking about the disproportionate impact that hacked information has, right? So if you took $100,000 and put it into the system to convince people to love democracy, it's not going to have the same kind of impact, right? So it's the particularly salacious nature of the disinformation that's being fed into the system.
But there's another factor. The $100,000 is just the figure for their paid ads. This is not the organic content. This is not the viral stuff. That's the stuff that got the traction. Those of you who are saying $100,000, you've bought the line of argument of the platforms who say we couldn't have made a difference, it was only $100,000. Nice move, platforms. That's not what created the circulation of the content.
Well,
and
the point is, why do things like that go viral? They go viral because of the intrinsic attraction of that kind of disinformation as compared with less salacious, sort of more veridical information.
Well, it's because in social media, the likelihood that something is going to spread is predicted by the likelihood that it's negative content that is based on fear, on prejudice, on anger. Negative emotions drive virality. And negative content has the capacity that positive content does not. It's the reason $1 spent on a negative ad gets you greater impact with voters. It's the reason we have so many attack ads that $1 positive ad just doesn't give you. And it's because we as human beings process negative information more quickly, more deeply, we're more readily able to recall it, and it anchors attitudes more strongly. And what that means is, if I can play to your basic dispositions, I'm not running counter-attitudinally now, basic dispositions, with fear, anger, prejudice, all of those things that are at the core of you on some kind of issue, and the content is negative content. The likelihood you're going to absorb it and process it, if it's ideologically consistent with what you already believe, is pretty high. Hence, I can increase the salience of that as an issue with the message imbalance, change the number of considerations that are available to constrict to those more hospitable to one candidate, and that's how you get your effect on the margin. And communication effects are never big. Communication effects are relatively small. But when you have early voting for a full month period, 45 million or so votes are available, a short-term stimulus can create an impact.
Right.
So give me an election that's traditional, you've got high level of party identifiers, the election's over before the conventions. You're not gonna change during the conventions. This one you could, because you had voter susceptibility.
Ma'am, in purple
I
scarf.
want to, I understand what you're saying. I want to reconcile that with your criticism of the mainstream media. You have the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're the last ones to come out with a story. And you're saying that it makes sense, they should do there should be more investigative reporting. But by the time they come out with a story, Twitter has already told the story. Social media has already told the story their way. So how can the New York Times and the Washington Post fix what social media has created? How can they educate when the news is already out there and being spread as misinformation?
Yeah, I'll make your argument more strongly than you're making it. You've got, across the broadcast media, you've got fragmented media now. And you've got ideological channels that are consistent with people's dispositions that they can gravitate to, into which they enclave. And in those enclaves, they're less likely to be open to information, even if the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the mainstream are on one page on something. So we have a complex media environment that means when you say fix it, the likelihood that you ever will eliminate something is non-existent. The question is, what extra benefit does it get when the mainstream all fall in line with it, and as a result create that impact over and above what else was going to happen inside the ideological enclaves? We made that argument, by the way, in a book called Echo Chamber, which is now getting a lot of citations, even though it came out in 2008. That was a book that argued that what you're seeing is enclaving into both the right and the left of like-minded individuals who are only primarily consuming news that is consistent with their ideology.
Sir.
Yeah, you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't target the right people,
Correct.
it doesn't matter.
That's right.
And if you look at Pennsylvania, it was, I believe, 44,000 votes. All you needed to do was change 22,000 votes. And that was an area that Hillary Clinton, if you look up at Luzerne County and Lackawanna County, that are always won by Democrats, we lost up there. And she lost up there because she didn't go there. She didn't target it. So you really have to focus your money and your campaign in the right area.
Yeah.
And you don't have to spend any money if you focus your candidate in that area. And it wasn't done.
Yeah.
And the same thing could be said about Michigan, which is what, 22,000?
And Wisconsin.
And in Wisconsin was 11,000. You change half of that vote differential, give it to Hillary, she wins those 3 states.
You change that, you take the baseline Stein vote in 2 out of 3 of those states, 2016 compared to 2020, and you just take the baseline, say she's gonna hold her baseline of 2012, take the difference, give it to Hillary Clinton, she will win the electoral vote in those 2 states.
Right.
So one of the reasons that this is an argument that is interesting to make is there are so many different pathways to get to the numbers that you need under the existing, you simply suppress the black vote enough, you're going to get there. You fail to mobilize up the Trump supporters in those 2 constituencies, he's not going to get there. You fail to do the shifting over on Stein, you fail to get there. So there are so many different combinations. The statistical likelihood that one of them got there is pretty high. But I want to make sure that I'm clear about saying Hillary Clinton should have gone to the 3 key states. If the goal of my book was trying to elect Hillary Clinton, I would be making all those arguments. It's not. It's trying to understand, given what they did, what happened. And she didn't go there. So build in she didn't go there. Now, that everything else that happens, now put these 3 Russian pieces in, and do you get enough of a swing in the battleground on those states? And the theory on the hacking has to be that the effect is distributed across the whole nation because it's national news. So that would mean that there's a vote change across all of the states, but you're only seeing it in the battleground in those places. And the depression would be greater across those other states as well. But it's only 0.5 to 1% to be able to do that.
Kathleen, let me get a couple of questions in at once before you answer, so because we only have about 9 minutes left. I've been ignoring this side of the room, so let me get one from over here, then I'll get one over here. Yes, sir, and then ma'am after.
So kind of as a follow-up to that, I think you said earlier that for this thing to work, that the theory of the election must be sound.
Yep.
And in this election where arguably neither candidate ran a good election, you had a flawed candidate, you had a bad message, how would you respond to the observation that maybe the Russians did us a favor by getting everybody focused on what Americans really cared about? And whether you agree with the outcome or not, that's really what everyone cared about, so that's what got elected.
All right, don't answer that yet.
And I'm also wondering how one takes into consideration the disaffected Bernie Sanders voters, who I believe did have a lot of effect on the outcome of the election. I have anecdotal evidence, because I was very involved in the Sanders campaign, that many Sanders voters actually didn't vote, voted for Jill Stein, or voted, unbelievably, for Donald Trump. And I have spoken to those people. So I think that the DNC itself did an awful job of running a primary, and that disaffected a lot of voters and affected the outcome of this election.
Let me let one more person out.
Also, the more I listen, the more I agree with your title of the book, and that it was a cyber attack, and it is a cyber war, and I'm a little troubled that you're willing to back off from that, because the intelligence community has asked you to, because if it would have been on a dam that the infrastructure was hacked, or our electrical grid, it would have been an attack. It is an attack, whether, as that gentleman said back there, we've been guilty of it too, and so have other countries. We need to respond accordingly, and I sense that maybe diplomacy is, if you say, yes, it was an attack, then you have to respond, and they're not sure how they want to escalate that.
And this is a point that you make in the book, which is actually, I think, a very important point, which is once you start calling events in cyberspace acts of war, you have to have an understanding of how you're going to respond to that. And it opens up, huge vistas of potential kinetic response, even preemptive kinetic response to cyber threats that our military and intelligence communities really haven't coalesced around in terms of common responses. So I had the same reaction, I have to say, as others in the security community who say, wait a second, we're not talking about war here, but we are talking about violations of sovereignty, and that worries me a lot.
So the
let
new
me
title will
invite
be
you to-
Violation of Sovereignty.
Right. It doesn't sound as sexy.
So let me address the Sanders issue. The hacked content is what let the Sanders people know that the DNC had its thumb on the scales against Bernie Sanders and made it difficult for her to consolidate the Sanders vote at the convention. She almost has a walkout at the convention because of the content that is released by the Russians to WikiLeaks that comes into, and DC Leaks and Guccifer 2, and comes into the media stream as a result. So the strategic use of information changes the media stream in a way that then speaks to all the concerns that you always have when you've got a primary challenger who stays to the end. The biggest challenge is consolidating. She had trouble consolidating that vote, and you're providing personal evidence that that is the case. And then the question is, so if that hadn't been there, if that evidence hadn't been there, and Sanders was still making the appeals to consolidate, would some percent of those have consolidated? Now remember, I've got all these pathways to get to that 78,000. Here's one of the pathways.
But is the hacked statement, are they true?
Sure.
If they're true,
I mean, true.
I want to know that.
Yes, well, and the argument for the hacking is, what's wrong with revealing what's actually in the stream?
I want to
But
know that.
let me give you the way the media spin occurs on it can be problematic. And I will grant that Debbie Wasserman-Schultz resigned for good reason.
But then she was being appointed to something.
But for practical purposes, there is an exchange with staffers that's released through the hacked process, through the press, in which the question is, should a question be posed to Bernie Sanders about whether he's really an atheist? Would that disadvantage him? These are staff members talking to each other. It never happened. There's no evidence Hillary Clinton ever embraced it. It nonetheless becomes news and invites the inference that somehow she's responsible for it. Now, I've worked in campaigns. I bet many of you have as well. I bet if you took back a look at everything you said to everybody else in some channel back then before there was social media, you'd find some snarky things you said to each other about things you'd like to do to the opposing candidate that you never actually intended to act on. I bet since you were probably a young person, you were also posturing a lot in relationship to others of the opposite sex. And as a result, some of this isn't even plausibly going to happen within your own circles. So when the press takes that and magnifies it up as if it was a plausible scenario that she endorsed, I view that as unfair. When you get the Palmieri exchange with someone outside the campaign, now she's in the Clinton High Command, and they're speaking in a fashion that could be viewed as disdainful of conservative Catholics in the context of being snarky about Rupert Murdoch. Now think about this for a moment. These are liberals and they're being snarky about Rupert Murdoch. Are you surprised? And in the process, they're making comments about what religious affiliation their children have. Male-female interaction among friends, it's highly telegraphic. There's no evidence that Hillary Clinton regarded these constituencies with disdain or that the campaign did, yet it makes news. So now the question is, when that comes into the media agenda, and you've got people who are already somewhat disaffected, but they're disposed to vote for the Democrat, what happens to their likelihood to cast that vote, particularly when, now somebody else mentioned the polls are telling you she's gonna win anyway. Well, that's a media effect, the polls were wrong.
Last round.
At the previous CERL presentation, holding Facebook and Twitter accountable has come up a lot. I was wondering if you feel that YouTube has been adequately held to account, because I find it amazing. Every time I type in PBS NewsHour, I get a string of, well, you would love this RT, you would love this other highly incongruous suggestion. And apart from the information disclosure, and it gets maybe a little too math for me or maybe other lawyers, but the algorithm to me drives me crazy.
The algorithm has mistargeted you. So the question is, what cues are they reading to suggest
but if
that?
they're doing it to me, why? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean the algorithms are constantly tuning themselves, and they're getting better and better at guessing what it is that you're likely to. Now the question is, have you ever opened the RT?
I don't think so.
Okay, because I mean the minute you open something, the algorithm says, "Ha, we found you." But yeah, I mean
they're doing it to me a relatively sophisticated.
But RT is a legitimate part of our media ecosystem, required to register in the Foreign Agent Registration Act. If it's following you because it wants you as an audience, that's perfectly legal, and in my judgment, it's perfectly fine. As long as you know it's RT, and you can say, okay, I would like to be exposed to Kremlin propaganda.
Kathleen, this has been an incredibly interesting discussion, and it's wonderful to have you here in person as well as to have your book to read. To all of you, it's fantastic to see people who come back and to see our programs regularly. We have, I'd like to introduce Eileen Kenny, who is our Director of Engagement. If you'd like to become more involved in CERL and in various ways support our efforts, please speak to Eileen. She'd love to get to know you, and we're so happy to have a community of folk that support our work and are interested in what we do. With great thanks to Kathleen Jamieson. Please join me in